Sniper on the Eastern Front, the Memoirs of Sepp Allerberger. Chapter 1, Part 2.
The first stage of our attack began at just before 5 with an artillery barrage. The idea seemed to be to plow the terrain in front of us in progressive stages. The earth was turned over with a succession of dull thuds, the explosion from each shell spraying large clumps of sod into the clear morning sky. As each salvo lengthened, I became aware of strange, sickening screams amidst the roars of shells impacting and the whizzing sigh of metal splinters. We German Jaeger cowered in our trenches and awaited the order to advance. After about 20 minutes, the artillery barrage fell away and an ominous silence fell, through which the terrible cries of the Russian wounded were clearly audible. The order came to attack. Suddenly, all my nervousness disappeared. The battle sucked us forward across the broken earth like a whirlwind. The Russian artillery opened fire. As I rose up from my trench, the first shells began to explode in our ranks. I heard a whizzing, ripping noise nearby. My comrade immediately to the right, an 18-year-old from Berchtesgaden, had been hit. A splinter had ripped open his tunic and abdomen, allowing his intestines to pour free. After a second or so of disbelief, he attempted to restore the steaming organs. I laid down my MG, thinking it my duty to help him. The NCO, non-commissioned officer, clapped my shoulder and shouted,
"Forward, attack! There's nothing more you can do for your friend. Give the men covering fire."
The wounded youth had sunk to his knees, from where he fell face first in the churned earth. I retrieved the MG and scrambled forward, my mind empty of thought. The primeval instinct for survival had taken possession of me. Death, fear, anxiety had lost their meaning. Shoot, reload, move forward was the only reality. Seek cover, search for the enemy like an animal of prey. Within me, a strange metamorphosis was taking place. The low brow who had risen from the trench would, during the next few hours of violent battle, become an infantryman. Better still, a warrior in the original sense of the word. Fear, blood, death were the ingredients in an alchemy that intoxicated and drugged its participant. It marked the end of my personal innocence and swept away all visions and dreams of my future. Swept away my life. I was being forced to kill. Killing on the battlefield was to be my trade. Fate required of me that I should perfect it to mastery. For a brief while, we moved forward, unmolested by enemy fire. Protected by the MGs on its flanks, our group crept warily through the bushy terrain. When firing commenced from a concealed position in the undergrowth about 20 meters away, a Jaeger fell without a sound in the stream of bullets from a machine pistol. I returned MG fire without hesitation, while the men threw themselves down. Once a salvo of stick grenades had silenced the Russian fire, the Jaeger snaked forward to the enemy hide, which was by now abandoned. Beyond the bushes lay the bodies of 4 dead Russians who had fallen just short of the entrance to the artfully concealed underground gallery. It had probably been their home for months. Fresh tracks led into the shaft. A mixture of curiosity and fascination drove the Jaeger patrol, rifles cocked, ever deeper into the abysmal darkness. A few minutes after the ground had swallowed them, I heard the dull sound of shooting from within, and a brief while later the patrol tumbled out into the daylight. All of them white as a sheet, some retching, all visibly horrified. There was no time for questions, for just then a Russian company launched a fresh attack, and the whirlwind of the firefight tore us away with it. The bitter struggle continued until dusk fell at about 10, when our platoon retired to the forward trenches from where we had embarked upon our advance early that morning. The extent of the Russian resistance had been underestimated, and we would have to repeat the whole procedure on the morrow. Both sides reorganized overnight, allowing each other a few hours' rest. The pause was also used to distribute ammunitions and rations, and bandage the walking wounded still able to fight. I considered it a minor miracle that I had spent the day without incurring a scratch, in contrast to many of my comrades. Squatting with a chunk of bread, a tin of sardines, and a cigarette, we reviewed the events of the day in brief snatches of conversation. I asked about the occurrence in the underground gallery. In pithy sentences filled with undisguised disgust and horror, the two surviving Jaeger told their story. It involved an event, irrational and incomprehensible, such as often occurs in war, which gave us an insight into the type of enemy, the type of human beings, if you could call them such, that the political commissars were. Gingerly feeling their way forward through the gloom, our patrol had progressed about 50 meters when they came to an ill-lit alcove around which wafted a bestial stink. They waited for their eyes to accustom to the darkness and then took it all in. In one corner cowered 2 Russian soldiers, youths who appeared to be about 16, huddled together for safety. In another corner were a number of ammunition boxes arranged to make a table which bore the remains of a dismembered human body. The cadaver had apparently been smoked over a fire for preservation and later use as rations. A third corner had been set aside for the usual ablutions and general waste, which now included putrefying body parts, bones, and human organs rejected for consumption. Curious, a Jaeger asked the 2 trembling Russian survivors for an explanation. He was assisted by a Jaeger interpreter who happened to speak some Russian. The 2 young Russians stated that during the Soviet retreat in August the previous year, when German panzers, rolling forward towards Maikop and the Russian oil fields, had overrun Voroshilovsk, 35 Russian soldiers had been left behind with strict instructions to occupy this gallery unnoticed for as long as possible, or until the Russian counteroffensive succeeded. As the months passed by, the supplies became exhausted. The group leader, a political commissar, had been charged with the strictest enforcement of the orders. When finally the men had mustered the courage to protest and demand a withdrawal from the gallery, the commissar had simply put down the little revolt by drawing his pistol and shooting 2 protesters in the head. Brandishing the weapon towards the survivors, he had ordered them to eviscerate the bodies and smoke the flesh over a fire. The livers, being edible fresh, were to be removed and divided into equal portions for immediate consumption. Over the next few weeks, the smoked human flesh had supplemented their rations. The political officer had the support of his sergeant and 2 NCOs who kept the weapons under lock and key. Once the requirement arose for more meat, the commissar selected another victim and shot him. It was these remains which the German patrol had found on the makeshift table. A few days later, the Russian counteroffensive began, and as it swept over the gallery, the group had emerged at last to engage German forces. In the lugubrious gloom, with its unspeakable odor, a Jaeger vomited. Upon finishing, he released the safety catch of his MP40 as he stood up, said simply, "You filthy scum," and emptied the contents of the magazine into the 2 Russians. The platoon NCO ordered everybody out, and they stumbled at the double through the apocalyptic tunnel to breathe the fresh, sweet air above ground. For the veterans, this was merely an episode, but it provided me with an insight into the abyss of the human state in war. It was an indication of how the Soviet political system, through its commissars, was prepared to sacrifice all vestiges of human decency in the treatment, even of its own, in the quest for victory. There had been rumors that an order had been issued from the highest level to the effect that these political commissars were not to be afforded the status of prisoners of war if captured, and perhaps there was some obscure justification for that alleged directive being given. 3. Yet even so, that vile gallery had been a gentle, and for us, harmless initiation into what was to follow. There was no time for deeper reflection. The important things were food and sleep, and precious little time remained before daylight came. Supported by artillery and self-propelled guns, it took us another 4 days to wear down the Russian resistance. We retook the high ground at Voroshilovsk, but it cost us the lives of 650 German soldiers to do so. By the end of these 5 days, I had lost what remained of my youthful innocence. The experience of the fighting to regain Voroshilovsk left its mark on my now pinched features. To judge by my reflection in the mirror, I had aged 10 years. At the outset, my platoon had consisted of 20 men, of whom the NCO and myself were the only survivors. I had lost the feeling for time anxiety, fear, compassion. I was a living football of events, propelled by the boot of an archaic survival instinct fueled by the interchange of fighting, hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. On the 22nd of July, 1943, we re-established the German front line. The Russians fought with a courage born of desperation. Well camouflaged, they often displayed tremendous discipline in the field, refusing combat until within 50 meters, at which distance the survivors inflicted significant casualties in our ranks, and their snipers in particular wrought havoc among the Jaeger. For myself, I was uncomfortably aware that the SMG gunner at the front was on a suicide mission. The tactical importance of MGs meant that they were pinpointed as priority targets in battle and received the attentions of heavy infantry weapons such as mortars and infantry guns, not to mention snipers. The losses in machine gunners were therefore disproportionately high. The first few days at the front had made it obvious to me that my chances of surviving to my 19th birthday were rather slim, and depended largely upon whether I could exchange my work as a machine gunner for another line of business at the earliest opportunity. That same day, I received a splinter wound to the left hand. One accepts such things with cool fatalism as an occupational hazard of war. To my surprise, it gave me no pain and hardly bled. After testing the flexibility of my hand a few times, I withdrew behind my MG to apply a field dressing. My number 2 helped me to quickly wind the thick gauze over the gaping wound. As soon as we had finished, he yelled a warning. "Sepp, ahead, they're coming. Shoot, shoot." The pain did not set in until several hours later, by which time my platoon had been pulled out of the line and could enjoy a little peace. The field hospital assembly point was near the field kitchen. A surgeon, accompanied by several assistants, waited to make a preliminary inspection of reported wounds. I was directed towards a small thatched farm cottage set a short distance from the regimental HQ. Entering the field dressing station, a large marquee, I registered without emotion the groaning, whimpering, a few cries of pain, and the smell of raw flesh. One of the medical corps NCOs sorted the arriving wounded according to the severity of the wound. A very young soldier was carried in on a stretcher, his now paraplegic body wobbling below a boyish face from which issued repeatedly the words, "I can't move anything, oh God, I can't move anything." The medic sergeant raised the upper body, which was uninjured, to the front. Between the shoulder blades gaped a wound of 2 hands' width through which some splintered backbone and rib segments were visible. Carefully laying the patient to rest, he said, "He is beyond help, Junge. With these injuries, death will come as a blessing. Take him to the clergyman in the barn over there." The barn was where the hopeless cases were brought to receive, from a visibly overcome Wehrmacht Catholic priest, the last rites and spiritual help in their final moments. My own injury was classified as minor, and I had to queue to be attended to. There was little privacy. A sergeant was seated nearby, his right arm bound in a handkerchief and stick tourniquet. The hand was attached to the forearm by a few tendons. He was clearly in shock. Whether this was considered a minor injury, I had no means of knowing. My turn arrived after 3 hours. The duty of the medic sergeant was to cleanse and stitch flesh wounds. Without speaking, he removed my dressing, examined the wound for possible foreign bodies, and cleansed it with a sulfonamide solution. A very muscular medic private then seized the arm in a judo hold and turned me to obstruct my view of the wound. Immediately, and without any anesthetic, deftly and with great skill, the sergeant began cutting the wound edges clean before stitching. Still holding my arm in an iron grip, the private advised me,
"Cry out quietly, it will help."
All my tensions and self-control now fell away, and I became fully aware of the pain. As I cried, I gave vent to my fury at all the inhuman experiences I had endured over the last 5 days. The wound required 14 days convalescence. I was sent to regimental reserve where I could perform light duties during the healing process. GJR 144 had suffered heavy casualties and was in the rear at Voroshilovsk for replenishment in personnel and material. As an apprenticed carpenter, I was assigned to the regimental arsenal and given the job of sorting through a mountain of captured Russian weapons. In the second week of my convalescence, I worked at repairing the stocks of damaged German carbines. In the relative quiet and safety of the rear area, I determined to accept the first chance that offered itself to avoid being returned to the front as an MG gunner. Who knows what quirk of fate operated that I should discover in that great heap of Russian weapons a sniper's rifle which had been captured by my company and, overlooked, had not been sent on to the rear collection center. It was a Moissin Nagant 91 30th model. At once, I petitioned the chief armorer for permission to practice with the weapon. There was Russian ammunition available in plenty, and the far-sighted warrant officer said,
"Show what you can do. Perhaps you're a born sharpshooter. We can use men like that to keep Ivan on his toes. You know yourself how their snipers make our lives a misery."
I grasped the opportunity gratefully, and that same evening began to practice. After a few days, I found that my aim was unerring. Apparently, without effort, I could hit a matchbox at 100 meters and the wooden lid of an ammunition box with sides 30 centimeters long at 300 meters. The chief armorer confessed himself impressed. My wound was healing well, and all too soon my 14 days' convalescence came to an end. With orders to return to my company, I reported to the chief armorer to take my leave of him. Handing me a Pu-4X magnification telescopic sight of Russian manufacture, he said,
"Sepp, I have spoken to your company commander and told him about your shooting ability. He has no objection to your testing your luck as a sniper. So, Junge, show Ivan what you can do."
In the first days of August 1943, I rejoined my company, my Russian sniper's rifle under my arm. When I reported to the company commander, he presented me with the wound badge in black and a citation saying,
"Allerberger, don't think it's all behind you now. That was just a foretaste. Whatever else you do, remember to keep your arse down, particularly as a sniper. Now fall out and get Ivan annoyed."
The front was relatively quiet, activity being limited to the occasional minor artillery duel and skirmishes with reconnaissance patrols, although the pressure from Russian snipers was enormous. It was very dangerous to expose oneself momentarily, and despite the greatest precautions, they regularly found a new victim. My company commander was a very open personality, convinced of the advantage of having his own team of snipers and who complained bitterly at the lack of them. His was not a generally held opinion. Many officers considered the sniper to be no better than a blackguard and his craft a dishonorable and perfidious form of warfare, and thus refused to have any. An officer of 3. G.D. set out his objections in his memoirs thus.
Was he perhaps one of those marksmen who at daybreak or dusk slunk out and lay still, his gaze like that of a cat observing a mouse hole, waiting for a shoulder, a head to appear, just for a second, but long enough? A shot cracked the stillness. From a hand slowly losing its grasp, there fell an empty fruit tin, the basic need which cost a man his life. Is that warfare? In the Second World War, a major problem for soldiers on active duty, living rough in a confined space, such as trenches, was the disposal of solid excrement. It was frequently not possible to dig some form of latrine trench, and so the practice of infantrymen was to have a personal camping loo, usually a large tin which would then be emptied over the trench parapet. This action tended to expose some part of the body, and an enemy sniper would have no hesitation in accepting the opportunity to fire a bullet into it.
The lines written by the 3 G.D. officer do not reflect reality. When night fell over the respective trenches, it did not bring with it a truce. Patrols tended to wander abroad at night into no man's land. The capture or killing of an enemy sentry, or the lobbing of a few grenades into the opposing trenches during such a mission, had never been considered unethical in the earlier Great War. War is neither ethical nor heroic. Its purpose is to obtain a political objective by the use of maximum force in the field, and it is ultimately irrelevant to any victim whether he fell to a sniper's bullet or was ripped apart by a hand grenade. Once satisfied that the sniper was not outlawed by international convention, it was the three. GD officers' duty to ensure that proper precautions were in place to protect their own, and then respond in kind. This raised certain ethical questions which I will tackle later. Whereas the use of the tactics described may well have been considered perfidious, any objection to freelance marksmen skilled in fieldcraft using their abilities to the advantage of their own side at the front seems ridiculous. I had managed to shed my suicide job as an SMG gunner. I was now directly responsible to the company commander, and as the situation at the time was one of defending the trenches, I was given free rein to fire at whatever target I thought fit. By instinct, I did the right thing, and on the first day went from trench to trench interviewing colleagues on their impressions of enemy activity, and in particular about anything observed in the adjacent 300 meters of no man's land. Everywhere I was met with a sigh of relief. At long last, a sniper. Show them, Sepp. An MG platoon commander took me by the sleeve and led me to a sap. For protection, the forward edge of each trench had a parapet of logs. Through a small chink between two sturdy logs, he indicated the lie of the Russian trenches and told me,
In no man's land, ahead of their lines, there is a sniper. He has been there several days. He shoots at absolutely everything. Look, he even holed the cooking pot we raised above the parapet. Think you can get him off our backs?